A corrupt politician tried to crush a small-town farmer under mountains of red tape, hoping to steal her family's land for a luxury development. He thought she was just an uneducated country girl. He didn't realize that in her attic lay a piece of paper that would cost him everything. Oakhaven was a town that had aggressively forgotten its roots. Once an endless expanse of golden wheat fields and sprawling dairy pastures in the American Midwest, the municipality had been swallowed whole by aggressive urban sprawl. Over the span of 2 decades, the sprawling cornfields had been paved over, replaced by manicured cul-de-sacs, sterile luxury shopping plazas, and towering gated communities. The scent of fresh rain on soil had been permanently replaced by the smell of exhaust and freshly poured asphalt. At the very center of this rapid gentrification sat the Higgins Dairy and Orchard. It was a beautiful, stubborn anomaly. 120 acres of rolling green pasture, ancient apple trees, and weathered red barns that looked like an oil painting dropped right in the middle of a modern concrete jungle. Clara Higgins, a 32-year-old third-generation farmer with calloused hands and a spine made of steel, stood on her front porch, wiping grease from her jeans. She watched a pristine, white Tesla silently glide past her barbed wire fence. The occupants pointed at her Holstein cows with a mixture of amusement and visible disgust. Clara sighed. Wait, the city was closing in, and the walls were getting higher every single day. For years, Clara had managed to keep the family farm afloat after her father, Arthur Higgins, passed away. She modernized the milking operations, started a community-supported agriculture program, and sold organic cider that drew long lines on autumn weekends. The farm was profitable, sustainable, and entirely debt-free, but it was also sitting on the most valuable undeveloped real estate in the entire county. Enter Mayor Richard Stanton. Richard Stanton was a man who wore bespoke Italian suits to county fairs and possessed a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He had built his political career on modernizing Oakhaven, which essentially meant handing out lucrative construction contracts to his wealthy campaign donors. His crowning achievement was meant to be the Oakhaven Town Center, a massive multi-billion-dollar luxury residential and commercial mega-complex. There was just one massive problem standing in his way. The architectural blueprints required a central anchor location, and that location was currently occupied by Clara's grazing dairy cows. Stanton had approached Clara 3 times over the past year. He offered her money, then he offered her more money, and finally, he offered her thinly veiled threats. Every time Clara gave him the exact same answer. The land was not for sale. It was her family's legacy, the soil her grandfather had bled for, and no amount of corporate cash was going to pave over it. When money failed, Mayor Stanton decided to use the full, crushing weight of the municipal government. If he couldn't buy her out, he was going to zone her out of existence. The assault began quietly in early spring. First came the newly drafted city ordinance regarding nuisance odors. For a century, the smell of manure was just a fact of life in Oakhaven. Suddenly, Clara found herself hit with a $1,000 fine because the wind blew toward the newly constructed Whispering Pines subdivision. The wealthy residents who had actively chosen to buy houses bordering a working dairy farm were now relentlessly calling the police to complain that the farm smelled like a farm. 2 weeks later, the Oakhaven City Council, acting under Mayor Stanton's direct guidance, passed a sweeping noise abatement law. The law explicitly banned mechanical equipment operations exceeding 60 decibels before 8 in the morning. Clara's milking machines, which had to be run at dawn for the health of the cows, operated at 70 decibels. The city dispatched code enforcement officers to sit at her property line with decibel meters. Every morning she milked her herd. She accrued another $500 citation. Clara fought back. She attended town hall meetings, her boots tracking mud onto the polished marble floors of City Hall. She stood at the podium, presenting decades of agricultural protections and state right-to-farm laws. But Mayor Stanton controlled the zoning board, the municipal judges, and the local press. He sat on the dais, peering down at her with a condescending smirk, citing public health and the greater good of the community's economic future. By midsummer, Clara was drowning. The fines were piling up into the tens of thousands. She had to sell off a quarter of her prized herd just to pay the municipal penalties and keep the power on. She was exhausted, sleeping only 3 hours a night, trying to maintain the farm while simultaneously acting as her own legal defense. Then came Stanton's kill shot. In August, the city quietly passed an emergency infrastructure mandate restricting weight limits on County Route 9, the only paved access road leading to the Higgins farm. The new weight limit was set just low enough that commercial feed trucks and bulk milk transport tankers could no longer legally drive on the road. Clara walked down to the end of her driveway on a blistering Tuesday morning and stared at the shiny new metal sign, "No vehicles over 10 tons." It was a death sentence. If the feed trucks couldn't deliver grain, her animals would starve. If the milk tankers couldn't collect her dairy, thousands of gallons of milk would spoil in her vats. Mayor Stanton had effectively placed her farm under medieval siege. That afternoon, a sleek black town car pulled up to her gate. The window rolled down, revealing Mayor Stanton. He didn't even bother stepping out into the dirt. He simply handed a manila envelope out the window to her. "It's over, Clara," Stanton said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Inside is a final purchase offer. It's for exactly half of what I offered you last year. Sign it by Friday, or the city will seize the property for unpaid municipal fines and auction it off. Don't be foolish. You put up a good fight, but you can't beat City Hall." Clara sat at her scarred wooden kitchen table, the manila envelope sitting unopened in front of her like a venomous snake. The house was dead silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Outside, her remaining cows grazed in the fading twilight, entirely unaware that their home was scheduled for execution. She felt completely, utterly broken. The state agricultural board had declined to intervene, citing the complex nature of local municipal zoning loopholes. Her bank had called that morning, nervously inquiring about the mounting liens the city was placing against her property. Stanton had boxed her in with bureaucratic precision. With a heavy heart, Clara realized she had to start preparing for the end. If she was going to lose the farm, she needed to secure the family's historical documents and heirlooms before the bank locked the doors. She grabbed a flashlight and pulled the cord to the attic stairs. The attic was a sprawling, stiflingly hot space filled with a century of accumulated memories. There were antique butter churns, rusted plow blades, and stacks of leather-bound ledgers documenting crop yields from the Great Depression. Clara navigated through the cobwebs until she reached the back corner, where a massive iron-reinforced cedar trunk sat under a tarp. It was her great-grandfather's lockbox. Bartholomew Higgins had been the patriarch who guided the farm through the turn of the century. Clara brushed away the thick layer of dust and forced the rusted latch open. Inside were stacks of yellowed photographs, old war medals, and bundles of legal documents tied tightly with brittle twine. She sat on the dusty floorboards, methodically sorting through the papers. There were birth certificates, old loan documents from banks that hadn't existed in 80 years, and hand-drawn property maps. Then, near the very bottom of the trunk, wrapped carefully in a protective sheath of oiled leather, she found a heavy parchment document. The intricate calligraphy at the top read, "Municipal Land Lease and Covenant of the Township of Oak Haven, dated October 14th, 1912. Clara carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The legal jargon was dense and archaic, but as she read through the faded ink, her brow furrowed in confusion. According to the document, in 1912, the newly incorporated town of Oak Haven had been virtually bankrupt. They desperately needed a centralized location to build a courthouse, a police station, and a municipal administrative building, but they had absolutely no capital to purchase land. Bartholomew Higgins, who owned nearly 1,000 acres at the time, had offered them a deal out of a sense of civic duty. He didn't sell them the land. He leased it to them. Bartholomew had granted the city a sprawling 12-acre parcel right in the center of town for the sum of $1 per year. But Bartholomew was a shrewd, deeply protective man who distrusted politicians. He had insisted on a very specific, ironclad condition being written into the bedrock of the lease. Clara's eyes widened, her heart hammering against her ribs as she read the paragraph titled, "The Covenant of Agricultural Protection." This leasehold is granted to the township of Oak Haven in perpetuity, provided that the municipality shall forever act as a steward of the Higgins estate's right to cultivate the earth. The township shall pass no law, levy no targeted tax, nor enforce any ordinance that shall abridge, hinder, or penalize the agricultural enterprises of the Higgins family upon their remaining acreage. Should the governing body of Oak Haven ever violate this covenant and assault the livelihood of the farm, this lease shall immediately and irreversibly terminate Fontaforth Buddies to Portry D. Full ownership of said land, inclusive of all structures, improvements, and fixtures built upon it, shall revert entirely and instantly to the Higgins heirs. Clara stopped breathing. She read the legal description of the 12-acre parcel leased to the town. It was defined as Block 4, Lots 1 through 10 on the original county plat. She scrambled over to a pile of old maps, her hands shaking violently. She unrolled the original 1912 township map and compared it to a modern zoning map she had brought home from her fights at the planning board. Block 4, Lots 1 through 10, was the exact footprint of the current Oak Haven City Square, Mayor Stanton's opulent city hall, the newly renovated municipal courthouse, the police headquarters, and the mayor's own private multi-level parking garage were all sitting on land that the city didn't actually own. They were mere tenants, and by passing targeted ordinances to fine Clara's farm into bankruptcy, Mayor Stanton hadn't just broken a gentleman's agreement, he had legally triggered the reversion clause. Clara didn't sleep that night. At 6 a.m., she was sitting in her beat-up pickup truck outside a dingy strip mall on the outskirts of the county. The neon sign above the door flickered, reading Mitchell Bradley, attorney at law. Mitch Bradley was a brilliant but bitter real estate attorney whose career had been systematically destroyed by Mayor Stanton 5 years earlier. Mitch had tried to blow the whistle on one of Stanton's corrupt developer payouts, and in retaliation, Stanton had used his connections to blacklist Mitch from every major firm in the state. Now Mitch handled traffic tickets and petty disputes out of an office that smelled permanently of stale coffee and defeat. When Mitch finally arrived, unlocking his door with a weary sigh, Clara followed him inside and slapped the 1912 parchment down on his cluttered desk. "I need you to tell me if this is real," Clara demanded, her voice trembling with adrenaline. Mitch put on his reading glasses, annoyed by the early intrusion. But as his eyes scanned the old calligraphy, his posture changed. He sat up straight. He read it a second time, then a third. He looked up at Clara, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and predatory glee. "Where did you get this?" Mitch whispered. "My great-grandfather's lockbox," Clara said. "Stanton just passed Ordinance 44B, effectively banning my dairy trucks. Does that ordinance trigger this clause?" Mitch grabbed his coat. "Don't say another word. We are going to the county archivist right now. If the city never quietly filed a superseding title. Clara, if this lease is still the active chain of title, Richard Stanton just accidentally handed you the keys to his entire empire." The drive to the state capitol took 2 hours, but to Clara Higgins, it felt like 2 minutes. Mitchell Bradley's rusted sedan rattled violently as they sped down the interstate, neither of them speaking a word. The silence was thick with a volatile mixture of disbelief and mounting electric hope. If what Mitch suspected was true, they were not just going to save the farm, they were about to execute the most spectacular legal reversal in the history of the state. They bypassed the local Oak Haven municipal clerks entirely. Mitch knew better than to tip his hand to anyone within Mayor Richard Stanton's sphere of influence. Stanton had eyes and ears in every local office, and a single panicked phone call from a loyal clerk would give the mayor time to orchestrate a backdoor injunction or, worse, destroy the public records. Instead, They went straight to the State Archives and Land Bureau, a monolithic limestone building that housed the original, unalterable master deeds for every county in the state. They were greeted by Walter Simmons, a senior archivist who possessed the meticulous, unhurried demeanor of a man who spent his life exclusively with dead paper. When Mitch presented the 1912 parchment and requested the master property lineage for Oak Haven's central municipal block, Walter raised a skeptical eyebrow, but silently shuffled off into the cavernous, climate-controlled subterranean vaults. Clara paced the polished marble floors of the reading room, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. Her fingernails were still stained with the dark soil of her farm, a stark contrast to the sterile, bureaucratic environment. She thought about her grandfather, Bartholomew, a man who had survived dust bowls and economic depressions. He had possessed a profound mistrust of men in expensive suits who spoke of progress while lining their own pockets. He had built a trapdoor into the very foundation of the town, silently waiting for over a century for a crooked politician arrogant enough to step on the trigger. 45 agonizing minutes later, Walter returned. He was pushing a heavy brass cart bearing a massive leather-bound ledger from the early 20th century. He heaved the book onto the mahogany reading table, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, filtering through the high windows. "You have a very interesting piece of paper there, Mr. Bradley," Walter said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I checked the chain of title. I checked the municipal annexations from 1930, the restructuring of 1958, and the digital transfers of 1995. I was certain the city must have executed a quiet title action or purchased the land outright at some point in the last 100 years. And..." Mitch leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the table, barely breathing. Walter adjusted his glasses and pointed to a faded column of meticulous, cursive ink. "They never did. It's a textbook case of institutional amnesia. The original city council in 1912 knew they were just leasing the land, but as those men died or left office, and as the town expanded, subsequent administrations simply assumed the city owned the plaza outright. No one ever bothered to check the foundational deed, because why would they? It's City Hall, it's the police station, it's the courthouse. They've been there forever." Mitch let out a sharp, breathless laugh, running a hand through his thinning hair. He turned to Clara, his eyes blazing with a fierce, vindicated fire. "Clara, in property law, this is known as a fee simple determinable with a possibility of reverter. It means the property transfer wasn't absolute. It was entirely conditional. The moment the city broke the covenant, the absolute exact second Mayor Stanton passed that ordinance restricting your dairy trucks, their lease legally evaporated." "So, what does that actually mean for me?" Clara asked, her voice steady, but her heart hammering against her ribs. "It means," Mitch said, slamming his hand down on the ledger with a resounding crack, "that as of Tuesday morning the city of Oak Haven is trespassing on your private property. You own the ground under the mayor's leather desk. You own the dirt under the municipal courthouse. You own the parking garage. The whole 12 acres reverted to you instantly." Meanwhile, back in Oak Haven, Mayor Richard Stanton was in a foul, triumphant mood. He was sitting in his sprawling corner office, overlooking the city square, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. Across from him sat Charles Montgomery, a billionaire real estate developer from Chicago who was bankrolling the Oak Haven Town Center project. "Is the Higgins problem finally handled?" Charles asked, checking his gold wristwatch with a look of mild irritation. "My excavation crews are on standby, Richard. Every day we delay costs me $80,000 in idle equipment fees. I want that dairy farm leveled by Monday." "Relax, Charles," Stanton sneered, taking a sip of his drink. "The girl is out of options. The municipal fines have crippled her cash flow, and I just cut off her only access road. She can't feed her livestock and she can't sell her milk. The bank is preparing the foreclosure paperwork as we speak. I gave her until tomorrow afternoon to sign the surrender deed. When she doesn't, we seize the property for unpaid municipal infractions. The tractors can roll in on Saturday morning. The dirt is ours." Stanton was so consumed by his own arrogance, so blinded by his contempt for the working class, that he never once considered that the uneducated dairy farmer he was trying to crush was currently drafting his eviction notice. For the next 24 hours, Clara and Mitch worked in absolute secrecy. They drafted a mountain of legal filings, an emergency quiet title confirmation, a permanent injunction against the city's zoning ordinances, and, most importantly, a formal notice to vacate premises. Mitch utilized every favor he had left in the state judicial system to bypass the corrupt local Oak Haven courts, directly filing the action with the state superior court in the capital. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and a biting wind. The deadline Stanton had given Clara was noon. At exactly 11:30 a.m., Mayor Stanton stood on the grand limestone steps of City Hall, flanked by local news cameras, city councilmen, and Charles Montgomery. Stanton had called a press conference to officially announce the acquisition of the Higgins property and the groundbreaking of his billion-dollar legacy project. He adjusted his silk tie, gave his brightest, falsest smile to the cameras, and stepped up to the podium. "Citizens of Oak Haven," Stanton boomed into the microphones, his voice echoing across the plaza. "Today marks the dawn of a new era. We are finally removing the last stubborn obstacle to our city's glorious economic future." He didn't get to finish his sentence. Walking straight up the center of the plaza, cutting through the crowd of reporters and confused onlookers, was Clara Higgins. She wasn't wearing a suit. She was wearing her scuffed leather work boots, faded denim jeans, and a canvas chore jacket. Beside her walked Mitchell Bradley, clutching a thick stack of manila folders. The trap was set, the hammer was pulled back, and Clara was ready to drop it. Mayor Stanton's smile froze, instantly turning into a deep, irritated scowl. He leaned away from the microphones, gesturing frantically to two uniformed police officers standing near the courthouse columns. "Officer, remove this woman immediately," Stanton hissed, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "She is trespassing and disrupting an official municipal event." "Actually, Richard, she's not trespassing," Mitch Bradley shouted, his voice ringing out clear and sharp across the concrete plaza. He marched up the steps, completely ignoring the approaching officers. He stopped 2 feet from the mayor and slammed a heavy, court-stamped envelope directly onto the wooden podium. "But you are." The cameras pivoted instantly, lenses zooming in on the confrontation. The air grew perfectly still. Stanton stared at the envelope as if it were coated in poison. He let out a condescending scoff. "Bradley, I should have known this pathetic farmer would hire a disgraced ambulance chaser. Whatever frivolous lawsuit you think you're filing, it won't stop the foreclosure. Now get off my steps." Clara stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Stanton's. There was no fear in her gaze, only the immovable, granite resolve of 3 generations of farmers. "They aren't your steps, Mayor. They're mine." Mitch turned to the city's chief legal counsel, Gregory Walsh, who was standing nervously behind the mayor. "Greg, I highly recommend you open that envelope and read the first page before your boss embarrasses himself on the 6 o'clock news. It's an emergency declaratory judgment from the state superior court, signed an hour ago by Honorable Judge Reginald Barnes." Gregory Walsh cautiously stepped forward, picked up the envelope, and slid the documents out. He began scanning the first page. The crowd watched in breathless silence as the blood completely drained from the city attorney's face. His hands began to tremble violently, the thick legal paper rattling in the quiet morning air. He flipped to the second page, then to the attached copy of the 1912 Covenant. "Greg," Stanton snapped, losing his composure. "What is it? What garbage did he file?" Gregory looked up, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. He swallowed hard. "Mr. Mayor, it's an eviction notice." "An eviction notice for what?" Stanton demanded, his voice cracking. "For City Hall, sir. And the courthouse. And the police station. And the plaza." Gregory's voice was barely a whisper, but the microphones picked up every word. "According to this certified chain of title, the city has been operating under a conditional lease since 1912. The lease strictly mandated the protection of the Higgins agricultural estate. By passing the truck ban and the noise ordinances this week, we breached the covenant. The lease is terminated. The property has reverted. A shockwave of gasps rippled through the press corps. Camera shutters fired off like machine guns. Charles Montgomery, the billionaire developer, turned purple, realizing his multi-billion-dollar project was collapsing in real time. "That is absurd," Stanton roared, grabbing the papers from his attorney. "This is a forgery, a technicality. I will have you both arrested for fraud." "It's already been authenticated by the state archives, Richard," Mitch smiled, crossing his arms. "Judge Barnes reviewed the master deed this morning. He ruled the reversion clause is absolute and binding. The city doesn't own this land. Clara Higgins does. And you have exactly 30 days to vacate her property, take your desks, and get off her lawn." The fallout was catastrophic and instantaneous. By Monday morning, the story was national news. Oak Haven city government was entirely paralyzed. Stanton's high-priced outside defense attorneys scrambled, desperately trying to file appeals, citing adverse possession or laches, but Mitch destroyed them in court. He successfully argued that municipalities operating under written leases cannot claim adverse possession against their landlords, and since the breach of contract had occurred only days prior, laches did not apply. The law was absolute. The Higgins family owned the epicenter of Oak Haven. On Wednesday, an emergency closed-door mediation was held in Judge Barnes's chambers. Mayor Stanton sat at the polished mahogany table, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 3 days. He was sweating profusely, his political career entirely ruined. Clara sat across from him, sipping a cup of black coffee. She didn't want a concrete plaza. She didn't want to own a police station or a courthouse. She just wanted to milk her cows in peace. But she now held a nuclear weapon, and she was going to use it to secure her family's legacy forever. "Here are my terms," Clara said, her voice calm and authoritative, echoing in the quiet chamber. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "First, the city will immediately and permanently repeal Ordinance 44B, the noise abatement laws, and the nuisance odor laws. Second, the city will place a 100-year, unbreakable agricultural conservation easement on my farm, shielding it from any future development, taxation, or eminent domain attempts. Third, the city will reimburse me for the exact market value of the cattle I was forced to sell to pay your fraudulent fines." Stanton stared at the paper, his jaw tight. "And in exchange?" "In exchange," Clara continued, her eyes cold, "I will not evict the municipal government. I will lease Block 4 back to the city of Oak Haven, a new 99-year lease." Gregory Walsh leaned forward, desperate. "At what price, Miss Higgins?" Clara looked directly at Richard Stanton. $1 a year, just like my great-grandfather did. But there is one final condition for the lease." She tapped the paper. "Mayor Stanton resigns immediately, effective by close of business today, and publicly withdraws all city support for the Oak Haven Town Center development." Stanton shot to his feet, his face red with rage. "You can't do that. You can't dictate the elected leadership of this city." "I am the landlord, Richard," Clara replied, completely unbothered. "I can decide who I allow on my property. Sign it, resign, or start packing up your office." By 5 p.m. that afternoon, Richard Stanton's resignation letter was submitted to the city clerk. The mega development was officially dead, the billionaire investors fleeing the city in droves. A month later, Clara Higgins stood on her front porch, the golden autumn sun setting over her sprawling green pastures. The restrictive weight limit signs were gone from County Route 9. The low, comforting hum of her milking machines echoed in the crisp evening air, entirely unchallenged by the city. She had fought the towering, corrupt machine of modern politics, not with millions of dollars, but with the quiet, enduring foresight of her ancestors. The city had tried to bury her, forgetting she was made of the very earth they were trying to pave over. Sometimes the little guy wins, but they rarely win with this much spectacular, undeniable leverage. Clara Higgins proved that true power doesn't always wear a tailored suit or sit behind a massive mahogany desk in City Hall. Sometimes it's wrapped in dusty leather, hiding in a farmhouse attic. If you love this incredible story of ultimate revenge against a corrupt system, make sure to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable true stories.